Welcome everyone to the weekly Riot Science Club. So it is now 12 o'clock, and let's wait a couple of minutes. But while we wait, I would like to just remind you that the coming events of our coming seminars. So we have on 9th of July, Emily Sena, Liz Allen, Fiona Fickler, and Dan Quintana. And also don't forget to have a look into the YouTube channel, also in the open source, open science framework site, where all the slides and all previous seminars are also there as well. Yeah, and there is another kindly reminder about this nice event about calling the course of correcting bad science, which is going to happen on the 8th of July in the afternoon. So please join. It is also completely free and open to anyone anywhere in the world. Cool. So yes, let me introduce myself. My name is Miguel Xochicale. I'm a research associate at the School of Biomedical Engineering, where I'm basically working with ultrasound guidance engineering, and I have passion for robotics, chaos, AI, and open science. And I'm also part of this great team of RIOS, where I'm basically contributing to organize content, co-host events, and contribute to the awareness of the best practices of open science. And so then basically the logistics for this seminar essentially are that Olivia is going to start the talk, and then she may raise some questions. You have some, or she may respond some of the questions that you may have, or if not, then we can wait till the end of the seminar. Okay, so that said, I'm honored to welcome and introduce Dr. Olivia. So Dr. Olivia is Olivia Guest is currently a researcher scientist at the Research Center on Interactive Media, Smart Systems and Emerging Technology. And she is also affiliated as a researcher at University College London and University of London. Olivia research involves the creation of an evolution of computational accounts, that is deep and shallow artificial neural networks, for categorizing and conceptual representation of healthy adults, patient groups, infants, and animal models. Olivia is also an editor-in-chief at ReScience C and a topic editor at the Journal of Open Source Software. She is also committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion of open science, and also contributing and inspiring others like myself to do science along the lines of reproducibility, inclusiveness, transparency, reusability, and open accessibility. So today, Olivia Guest is going to talk about one of her latest preprints called How Computational Modeling Can Force Theory Building in Psychological Science. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Olivia.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That's very nice of you to say. I just need to figure out how to make this full screen. Is this looking good?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
You can see that.
Perfect. So thank you so much for the introduction. As you know now, my name is Olivia Guest, and I'm here to talk to you about how computational modeling can force theory building in psychological science. And this is some work that I carried out with my colleague, Andrea E. Martin. And as you can guess from the title, it is about how we can use formal and especially computational modeling to improve our theorizing in brain and behavioral sciences. I'm specifically going to talk and focus a little bit on psychology specifically, but I think this can be generalized to things like neuroscience as well. So before we jump into anything, I'd just like to give an overview of what I'm going to say. So first, what I want to tell you is a little bit of the backstory. So why did we come up with this model, this understanding of how to do science? What are the kind of thoughts or the kind of history? Why is this something that I've been thinking about? And why is it something that's perhaps very timely? Then I'm going to talk about something that we've called the pizza problem and explain what that is. Essentially, it's situations in which computational models have the ability to uncover gaps, holes, problems with our scientific thinking, and they do so in a way that is unique. And it's something that computational models do that even formal but non-computational models actually can't do. So it's like a very, very interesting and useful case where computational models can tell us something very deep about our own scientific thinking. And without them, we would not only not know how to address these problems, but we might not even know that they exist. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that in a minute. And then after that, what I'm going to say is about specifically explaining our model of how psychological science is carried out, should be carried out, could be carried out. And I'm going to get into basically the meat of this talk, which is about this model that we propose, and explain to you how it can be used to understand where a research program is, where a paper is, where a researcher is, like the context of the kind of work that they're doing, and allow us to interpret it, embed it in a wider scientific context, and even do things like understand at the kind of stage that the research is in, what things could go wrong, what the next step is, and so on. And then finally, I'm going to end on giving some ideas about where we might be headed as a field, and what things can be done to kind of go in the direction that we would prefer to go in. So what kind of steps we can take in the present in order to have the kind of scientific future that we want. So what things we can do to make our current research programs, our current understanding of how we do science, align with our goals of essentially doing better work. So why did we come up with this? What's the kind of story behind it? In about the early 2010s, so I think it was 2011, I went to a talk by David Shanks at UCL, where he spoke about how some social psychology studies that he was looking into, published by other people in social psychology, he was looking into these, and he discovered that a lot of these published experiments just don't replicate. So what was written in the published papers wasn't enough to get the same effect or the same outcome, experimental outcome. If someone followed what the paper said, they, in his case, he wasn't getting the same results. And that was part of, so David Shanks's work, and the talk that I went to was part of the beginning of what is now known as the so-called replication crisis. So it was part of a general re-understanding or reconceptualizing of social psychology, and I suppose psychology in general, where we, as a field, look back at published work or look at our current methodological practices and say, maybe something is up. So that made me start thinking and questioning what my sort of place in psychology and cognitive science is. because when I saw these things, I had my own take coming from a more computational background. And what it did was it made me question, like, so what am I, these people are just doing experiments and discovering that you know, other people's experiments are not replicating, and where does modeling fit in? Where do I fit in? Where do modelers fit in general when all of this empirical, you know, perhaps chaos is going on? So a good example or a good demonstration of how modeling and theory isn't really thought about or discussed as much is this figure here from a paper by Ivan Fliss, which shows the themes that emerge in the last half of the previous century in psychology. And you see here, like, there's a, you know, different words that that relate to things that people in psychological science research. And something that really pops out is that the word model or the word theory isn't really here, or at least isn't prominent. And that just shows, or reflects rather, my own grappling with my position in psychological science as someone who essentially sees their work as being all about models and theories. So this demonstrates perhaps in part why I felt that way. Going back to the replication crisis and understanding how our field reacted to it, there's a lot of different reconceptualizations of how we do research, and a lot of different models proposed to explain how we fail to take proper precautions or commit questionable research practices and so on. So this is an example of one of these high-level models. In black ink, we have the scientific steps, as I would call them, that our field sees itself as carrying out. So things like generating hypotheses, designing studies, collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting these results, and publishing them. And in red, we have the sort of things that could go wrong, or the things that we need to watch out for. So things like failing to control for bias, having low statistical power, having poor quality control, p-hacking, which is manipulating your data or your data analysis in such a way as to have a significant p-value, and publication bias, and the general concept of hacking, hypothesizing after results known, which is a kind of scientific sort of cheating or even misconduct. And again, this kind of makes me think, well, where is the word theory? Where is the word model? Where do I fit in? Am I not a scientist as well? Am I not a psychological scientist as well? Or is there something even deeper going on? Is it that people haven't really deeply thought about where theory might fit in, or where models might fit in? Is there, you know, are we not communicating with each other, and so on? So I guess this also underlines how theorizing and modeling are not at the forefront of dealing with results that don't replicate, for example. And just to really hammer this home, my perspective looking at these events in the, I suppose, history of psychology now, or in the development of the current understanding of the so-called replication crisis, my perspective is as a cognitive scientist. And the great thing about cognitive science is that it combines methods and understandings of the world and ideas and even methodologies from different fields, so philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, computer science, psychology, and so on. So we have this kind of slightly different perspective on how to do research in psychology, perhaps. And certainly a lot of people in cognitive science use computational models in order to embody their theories about human capacities or animal capacities or whatever we're interested in researching. So for me, computational modeling was something really central. And that kind of made me think, well, maybe there's two kinds of ways of doing psychological science. There's like using models, which is what I do and what many cognitive scientists do, and obviously many modelers do. And then there's something else where people don't really care about or even refer to models. And that kind of makes me uncomfortable. And just to presage everything, I don't think that's true, but it made me start thinking that at the time when my ideas were still developing. And I thought to myself, well, maybe it's something aligned with Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria. So even though we're all researching the same thing, we're all looking at the same kind of capacities, we're all interested in the same kind of scientific phenomena, is it that we're just coming at it from such different angles? Like modelers are doing this, and people who don't even care about models, who just do empirical stuff, are doing something else. So I think no, but my ideas were kind of still developing. And in October of 2019, I tweeted this out, which I think really underlines the importance of models. So I said why we need computational modeling, even if everybody agrees what the area of a circle is defined as, there are apparently people unwilling to execute the formal model itself. And not only that, but the results are counterintuitive. So what's happening here? As it says right down here, an 18-inch pizza has more pizza than two 12-inch pizzas, and people are losing their mind, is the end of that sentence. And then below that it says math is important, people. So what's going on here though is a bit more than just math is important, or maths is important, which is that there are two sort of food order options. There's the one order option, which is a single pizza with 18-inch with an 18-inch diameter. And then there's another order option, which is two pizzas that both have 12 inches of diameter. And what's happening here is that the sort of counterintuitive element is that people assume, myself included, this is, I'm sure I would have made the same mistake, people assume that the two 12-inch pizzas are more food, essentially, than the one 18-inch pizza. At the same time, people also agree or accept that a good way of quantifying the amount of food in a pizza is by defining it as the surface area. So using the formula of the surface area of a circle to define the amount of food in each pizza. And presumably we all know that formula, or have all at least been taught it and can all Google it. So why is it so shocking if we both agree, if we all agree that the amount of food is usefully or correctly defined as the surface area, and we all agree or we all think that two pizzas in this specific case are more food than one pizza? What's happening here is that there's a contrast or an expectation violation between two things that we agree on. We think that the two pizzas are more food, and we think that the surface area of a circle is a useful way of modeling the amount of food in a pizza. But when we actually run that model, that we think is a good model, when we actually put in the numbers for the surface area of the circle and get the end result, we're shocked or we're surprised or we're losing our mind, as the Mashable article says, because we find out that the 18-inch pizza is more food. And this is the crux, the core of why just formally describing something, so just agreeing that the surface area is a good model for the amount of food is not enough. You need to actually run the model, and you need to plug in the numbers, and you need to execute the model in order to really see the answer. In this case, a very simple example, but I think a useful one. So just to really hammer this home, what we have is we have a specification that we all agree on, which is the surface area of a circle is a good model for the amount of food in each order. So we have the two 12-inch pizzas and the one 18-inch pizza. And then what we have to do if we want to be a computational modeler, what we do is we go further. So this is just a formal specification using primary school level mathematics. So a formal specification, and what we want to do is we want to take that formal specification and we want to turn it into something that a computer can execute without us needing to really do anything other than obviously program it. So what I did here is I took the formula for the surface of the circle, and I made a little function out of that to calculate what I define as the amount of food in the order. And then I say that there's two pizzas with 12-inch diameter each, and one pizza with 18 inches diameter. And then what I do is I plug those values into what I call the food function, and I compare or ask the computer to tell me, is the food in two pizzas more than the food in one pizza? And that's the two orders that I have, and it will give me, I guess it will give me an unexpected answer if I was thinking that the two pizzas had more food. And what's really great about creating an implementation where you think really deeply about your spec is that you can then jump back up to the spec and really refine it. So we can really refine it and turn it into a much more generalizable spec where we have, I don't really want to get into this too deeply, but this is really just summing over surface areas of circles, right? Which is how we modeled our pizzas. And this is deciding between the orders, right? So this is very similar to the code. So just saying like, I'm going to pick the order that has the most phi, which I defined as the most sum of surface areas, right? So we can jump back up and refine our specification as a function of getting to grips with the implementation. This doesn't really change anything deeply about what we were saying before in our spec, but it does really tidy it up, formalize it, and allow it to be generalized to other pizza orders. So this is obviously a toy example, but you can see how, I hope you can see how this can be generalized to much more interesting and important psychological constructs. So now I want to move to talk about our model of, our path model of how psychological science is or could be described. Before I jump into doing that, I just want to give a essentially a caricature of what I think non-modelers think that modelers do, just to get this caricature out of the way and hopefully destroy it because it's wrong. So I think a lot of people think that modelers look at some data and then they invent a hypothesis and then they write some code to implement that. And then they write some spec for the code, as we were doing previously, the implementation and specification less than a minute ago. And then they come up with a theory, and then they come up with a framework. So this is a caricature, a wrong caricature, and this is not really what modelers do. But I just want to say this just so we can think about how maybe our ideas or our assumptions about what modelers do are imperfect. And I think what everyone else thinks they do, or what everyone else does who doesn't do modeling, I think they see themselves as doing this. So starting off with a framework, so some high level concept that they want to study, say like, oh, I want to look at semantic memory. and then they come up with a theory like, oh, I think that if you think of dog, you also think of other semantically related things like cat, blah, blah, blah. So a theory, more formal, hopefully, than what I just said. And then they specify it, which is really nailing down the specifics and hopefully or often using maths like we did before with the pizzas. And then they implement it in code. And then the code will spit out things to test, like very explicit hypotheses. So if we think back to the pizza example, the very specific hypothesis was 2 pizzas are less food than 1 pizza. And we can go and actually collect data based on that hypothesis that popped out of our computational model. We can literally order those pizzas and I don't know what, weigh them or something, or measure them with a ruler, the actual physical pizzas, right? Obviously, that's a toy example. We don't really need to do that. We can trust the surface area of a circle if we so wish, but we can also do what I just said, and that's the data. And the data, you know, supervenes over everything and is the kind of final word. So this is also a caricature. And I think what really happens is this. So I think what happens is that there are bidirectional connections or paths between these steps. And when we do science in psychology or in brain and behavioral sciences in general, what we do is we move between these steps using our judgment, hopefully, and the kind of general rules that I'm going to give you right now, which is that I think at any point we can move upwards. So if we have if we have a theory and we want to refine the theory or abstract away from the theory, we can put some of the information from the theory, again, using our judgment, into the framework. So we can move upwards from theory to framework and adjust the framework, the same for all the other levels. And then the other rule that constrains our movement is that we can only move down if we resolve expectation violation. So if we have an expectation for the level below us, we can only move down if that expectation isn't violated. If it is violated, we have to move upwards to an appropriate level above and adjust things. So what I mean by this is that if we, for example, have a hypothesis, we move downwards, collect data, and the data does not confirm our hypothesis, we cannot change our hypothesis to account for the data. We must move upwards and adjust our theoretical understanding of the world, because essentially the data has impacted our theory in a way that could falsify it, right? So we have to move upwards, adjust our theory, adjust our understanding of the world. I mean, obviously adjust our framework too, perhaps. It all depends. It's about our own judgment. So I just want to walk through this to give you some more concrete examples. So frameworks are things like connectionism. So the idea that neural networks and the connections between layers of units can account for psychological phenomena. So like the general idea that a neural network model is a useful model, or things like working memory, essentially that there exists working memory and it's worth creating theories within this framework to test them out. And then ACTA and SAW, this kind of idea of a cognitive architecture, which is to give you building blocks to create theories in a very formalized way. So a framework is essentially just a very high level thing that we set off to use to then create theories. A theory, on the other hand, is a set of sort of propositions. So something like a natural language or a set of natural language sentences, or maths or logic or figures that introduce as causal relationships with the aim of describing, explaining, understanding, predicting a set of phenomena. So a theory is essentially what we really crave as scientists, which is something that pushes our understanding of the world forward in an important way. So here I give examples of like prospect theory, which is in behavioral economics, with Scholar Wagner, which is about classical conditioning, and sustain, which is a computational theory of human categorization, or categorization in general, in fact. Specification. So specification, as we saw before with the pizza example, is basically taking our theory and really hammering it down into mathematics or natural language. So natural language is also okay for a specification, but obviously you have to write a lot of stuff to really nail down something with natural language, whereas with maths you can formalize it more concisely. There's also specification languages like TLA plus and Z. So they're a little bit like programming languages, but you can't really run them. They're kind of like maths essentially. And then from a specification, we can move to an implementation, which is essentially taking the spec and writing code. So you can use whatever programming language you want. In the pizza example, I used Python, but I'm sure you can imagine that's not super important. The reason that theory, specification, and implementation are in red in this figure is because quite often people who don't engage with modeling, so it's not that everyone needs to do modeling, it's that they need to engage with it. So people who don't engage with it normally skip these steps. So their work doesn't even cite this kind of work, or their framework doesn't even engage with formally specifying and implementing their theories. Then we have hypothesis. So a hypothesis is something really, really simple. You know, it's like group A will do this, group B will do that. Something very, very, doesn't really explain anything. It could predict something, it almost always predicts something, but it doesn't really explain anything about the world. It doesn't really enhance, on its own, it doesn't really enhance our understanding of the world. It's just a very, very simple output, essentially, of our theory, which, if done the way that I would like, has been filtered through specification and implementation, so it will be an output of a computational model. As we saw previously with the pizza example, it was the hypothesis that the code I wrote outputs is that one pizza is more food than two pizzas, and we go off and test that with data. And then obviously, as we're all familiar with in general, because analyzing data is a core component of most, if not all, psychology undergraduate courses, models of the data are things like frequentist or Bayesian statistics. And there we model our data in order to understand essentially if the data is in line with our hypothesis, and by extension in line with our computational model, implementation, specification, theory, framework, etc. So it's how we can use data to improve our understanding of the world. That's what a data model's function typically is. So to answer the question that I posed to myself, I suppose, at the beginning of the talk, I don't really think, given what I just described, that computational modelers and people whose research programs don't contain any modeling are in non-overlapping magisteria. I think we're all in the same kind of science. We're all essentially in the same field. And what I would really like to hammer home is that we all owe it to ourselves and each other to really formally, transparently, and openly share our theories by focusing on the red area of the path model as I presented. So by focusing on theory, specification, and implementation, we can be open and transparent about the theories that we commit to, because even if we engage in research without using a computational model, we can collaborate with people or cite people who have done that computational component of the kind of research that we're doing. And if we don't do that, that doesn't mean that we're not making theoretical commitments. All it means is we're not making explicit theoretical commitments. And what that does is it muddies the waters, and it makes it very difficult to understand what our data is telling us, understand where hypotheses come from. And without doing that, we are kind of stuck in a weird world where we collect data, but we're not sure, and we analyze the data, and we could analyze the data perfectly, but we might not be sure exactly what direction the kind of evidence is pointing us towards. So I guess in general, what I'm saying is not that everyone should be a computational modeler. Definitely not, because we need people to be experts in other things, like whatever, analyzing data, or you know, coming up with frameworks, or coming up with non-computational theories. What we need, though, is for people to be more open about where their theories come from, and where their and by extension where their hypotheses come from. And we need everyone in the field to collaborate with computational modelers, and we need computational modelers to be more willing to collaborate with people who don't do any modeling yet, whose research programs don't contain any modeling yet, in order to bring about what we call open theory, which is essentially the explicit statement by people of their theoretical commitments. So the genealogy behind where their hypotheses, where the hypothesis that they just tested came from. Because otherwise, you can just invent hypotheses out of nowhere, collect data based on that, and not really update any kind of theory, and not really push your field forward. So what about going forward? So what does this all mean for the future? What kind of recommendations do we propose? So one thing that we would really like to do is to radically recenter the role of modeling within psychological research. As I said, that doesn't mean that people who are not interested in doing modeling should start doing modeling. Not at all. It just means that they need to be aware that the theoretical constructs that they use to guide their research, and the hypotheses that they use to collect data, need to have some modeling, formal computational modeling backing. So modeling needs to be sort of understood as being a central component of the kind of science that we do. So yeah, I would like to just remind people that making a computational model is important, and if you don't have to make it yourself, but it would be great if you thought about including people who have these skills in the kind of research that you do. So yeah, thank you very much, and I'd just like to especially thank my collaborator Andrea E. Martin, and also thank you for inviting me.
Great talk. Thank you very much, Olivia, for this great talk. And I guess it's time for questions and answers. So I will start. Well, if you and want someone in the audience has questions, please ask them. So I will start with one question regarding, for example, let's say consider a pendulum, and then I guess your framework is very nice, and so my question is, where can we maybe consider starting using your model? Could it be anywhere in these different stages or different blocks that you have, or or should we maybe start, I guess, with the hypothesis? Maybe not starting with data, but yeah. So do you have like any sort of suggestion on how can this be interpreted?
Yeah, hang on, let me, can you still see my slides?
Yeah, I think I see you now, but
I think Trevor, could you just put yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Carry on. Yeah, we can see
Great.
you now.
Thank you. So the entry point into, I think this is what you're saying, by the way, so please interrupt me if I've misunderstood you, but the entry point, or the kind of starting point, however you want to see this, of a research program or an individual researcher of a paper can be anywhere there's no issue. So for example, you can start with data not even quite often, always you start with data. It's almost impossible not to start with data. It's normally anecdotal, but the data, but normally that is how everything starts. You know, you go out into the world, you see people behaving in a certain way, and this is anecdotal data, and you wonder like, oh, how can psychology explain this human behavior, or how can psychology explain this patient's symptoms, or all these questions that they're not from formally collected data, but they are from anecdotal interactions with the world. And then what you do is you move from the data, so upwards, not to hypothesis, obviously. I mean, if you want, you can, and then this path model of science will explain how to do that. But I would argue, obviously, you have to move to framework and theory. And what you do is you move to theory and you come up with a theory to account for the human capacity that you just witnessed, right? Something that explains that. And your theory will, as always, probably be wrong, but you refine it. So you go through theory, specification, implementation, your code spits out a hypothesis or many hypotheses that you then test properly with proper data, not just anecdotal data, but actually, experimental data. So I think it's about understanding that you can start off with anything as long as you do the steps that are highlighted in red, you're covered. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's really nice explanation, and I feel that, like, coming from the engineering background, I think this is really useful because we usually start maybe looking at the equations and doing experiments. Yeah, cool. So we have actually very nice questions in our quick Q&A. So I will start with this question that says, computational modeling seems great, but it also seems time consuming and hard. What simple steps can I take to start me on my journey? I'm doing a PhD in cognitive neuroscience.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of things to say here. I'm going to start with, I think, the obvious part of the question, which is that it's hard. So I think it is hard, and I don't think it's correct or fair to tell people that it isn't hard. It's difficult, but I also think that it's not correct and fair to say that it's uniquely hard. I think that analyzing, this person's doing a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. I'm pretty sure that analyzing fMRI, EEG, neuroimaging data is also hard, So I think that, yes, it's difficult, but I don't think it's uniquely difficult. I think that it's, there's so many things that are difficult. Learning English as a foreign language is difficult, but we have to do all of these things in order to do science. So a great point. I agree it's hard. Yes, it's also time consuming, but so are all the other things I said. What simple steps can I take? So I think that's a really nice part of this question. I would say there's essentially three things you can do to help you get to grips with computational modeling. So one is already what this person is doing, which is asking and engaging. So talk to people that do modeling. You don't have to do modeling yourself. I hope I've highlighted that enough in my talk, that for your science in general, for the research area that you're in, for your research program, you don't need to be doing the modeling yourself. Other people who are experts in modeling can do that for you. You just need to collaborate with them. You don't even need to collaborate. You can cite them, right? As long as they exist in the same scientific environment as you, you can include modeling in your work. So the other thing that I think about this, getting started on this journey, is yes, if you want to do modeling yourself, I think two of the most important things for that are, remember linear algebra from high school, if you were lucky enough that your high school taught you that, and teach yourself programming. These are not hard things. These are just as hard as learning how to analyze fMRI data or EEG data just as hard as learning another language and so on, right? So that's another thing. And then the other part of steps on to get started on this journey is essentially just read papers that have modeling in them, right? Reading papers that has modeling in them, even me as a modeler who's been doing modeling for 11 years, the first time I read a modeling paper, unless it's a model that I'm really familiar with, I don't really understand what it's saying. You have to read it like 5-6 times, I don't know, many times, right? And it's also like a well-known thing in maths and in, I don't know what other fields, but in very formal fields, it's a well-known thing that you don't get things the first time you read them. So don't be disheartened. I think there's, I can't remember who's written this sort of like a way to read maths books, but someone had written this thing about how you read maths, which is essentially like read it at least 3 times. The first time you just let the photons hit your eye and don't process it. The second time you try, and then the third time you really try. So I think that's really like all you can do. And then I guess the one last thing I would say about this is that in cognitive neuroscience, there's this general methodology called model-based fMRI or model-based neuroimaging, because obviously it doesn't have to just be MRI data. And I think getting to grips with that and understanding that is also useful if you're in neuroscience. So definitely whatever, check on the whatever your favorite search engine is for model-based studies to get started there.
Cool. That's very nice reply. Yeah, so we have other questions. This is another one which says, this hits so close to home. How can I convince my lab team that we should be doing more computational modeling? Any easy, immediate ways to convince others or to demonstrate how modeling can find its place in existing workflows or projects?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So how do you convince other people in your lab? Okay. It's very tricky, and it really depends. Okay, so it really depends on your position in the lab. So I'm going to assume that this person is obviously not the PI, because then they can just tell people in their lab to do whatever they want. I'm assuming this is a student, a PhD student or a postdoc. So I think in this situation, I think basically there's 2 things. One is you might not ever be able to convince people in your lab anything, right? It's very tricky. You're not in control of the lab or the ideologies of the lab. But taking a more optimistic perspective here, I guess you could ask them to read papers on this kind of stuff, right? So maybe ask them to read my paper if you do like a journal club, and see how they react to that, or even I guess ask them to read other related papers to mine as well, and try to get these ideas in their head. In general, as we know, it's very hard convincing anyone to do anything, right? Right. Okay. So the other thing is easy, immediate ways to convince others. So I would say that if people are open to learning, some really good examples are when models have uncovered, computational models have uncovered holes in people's thinking, right? So my favorite example, or one of my favorite examples, is this thing with the pizzas, where we're not even talking about psychology. We're literally just talking about the amount of food in an order. So I think if you show them things like what we call the pizza example, which comes with the pizza problem, if you show them things like that, they can start to hopefully understand the very general concept that computational models tell you things about your own ideas about the world that you otherwise wouldn't have uncovered, which I think is essentially the most important thing that a computational model can do, right? It basically tells you even your own ideas can have properties and repercussions that you haven't considered, which I think is a really, really deep point, right? And what's the other component of this question? It's demonstrate how modeling can find its place in existing workflows projects. So I think modeling, if you're doing cognitive neuroscience, then I think model-based fMRI is probably a really good example of where models can help us make sense of the huge data sets that come out of neuroimaging experiments. So I think that's like a core example. If you're thinking about in general how modeling helps, I guess think about all the cases in which a computational model has dramatically pushed the field forward. So look into, depending on where you are in what sub area of psychology you're in, look into how mathematical psychology, which is a specific type of computational modeling, perspective on computational modeling. Look at, for example, how mathematical psychology has modeled theoretical constructs in your area, or look at how cognitive science, so if you're in psychology, do a bit of a sideways look into cognitive science and look at how cognitive scientists have modeled or dealt with the kinds of theoretical constructs that your lab looks into. I think that will really help.
Cool. I think that's really nice, connecting to the following nice questions about are there any specific courses on computational modeling that you would recommend for people with little previous experience?
That's a good question. Any courses? I'm assuming they mean online ones. I'm going to have to get back to you on that one because I'm not aware of any courses on this that are specific for like psychology, cog neuro. I'm sure they're out there, but I'm just not aware of any.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, so we have another one. Also, feel free, anyone in the audience, to raise more questions. We still have some minutes to ask questions for Olivia. So the next one say, my background is in linguistics, and computational modeling was very popular, but then fell out of favor because the models were so complicated, they became implausible representations of reality. But perhaps this is a result of bad practice.
Right. Definitely a result of bad practice when models are too complicated to be useful. So I completely agree that if a computational model is not interpretable or scientifically useful, then by definition, people will dislike the model, correctly dislike the model, and it will fall out of favor. I would also say that just because computational modeling has benefits doesn't mean that it doesn't also have people misusing it or using it to kind of obfuscate their bad science, right? Very often, or not very often, but occasionally, people will use sophisticated computational techniques, generally, not even models, just techniques, right? A sophisticated data model, for example, to bamboozle or confuse reviewers, right? So definitely, these things can be misused. There's like a meme going around that I've seen recently that has some very, very sad, I've forgotten what it was exactly, but it was some very, very simple maths, you know, something like 1 + 1 = 2, and they replace every single thing with a much, much more complicated redescription, and it ends up just being like a mismatch, I don't know how you say that word now, a confusion of symbols that just at the end of the day means 1 + 1 = 2. So obviously, in the same way that in English, we can have a very simple sentence that has a meaning, and also a very complicated sentence that has the same meaning, but no one has any idea what that sentence is saying, right? We can have exactly the same thing with anything, with a formal model, with a computational model. So if people are misusing computational modeling for whatever reason, either because they're bad actors or because they're just not very good at modeling or some other reason, it will fall out of favor, and I guess rightly so, because why should something that's not useful be in favor? To avoid this, I guess, this is not really what the question is asking, but I think that's a sensible follow-up. To avoid this, again, it all boils down to collaborating and talking to modelers, so you don't get talking to good modelers, right? So you don't get these horrible things littering the literature in exactly the same way as you don't want terrible experiments littering the literature, and you don't want p-hacking in the literature, you don't want this, that, you don't also want terrible models.
Great. So I still have some few minutes. If someone else has any questions, please do so. So just maybe quick question from your last point. You mentioned about probably reading works of good modelers. So maybe because you've been working in this area for a good time, maybe you may have like some sort of list or I guess like potential like researchers doing good modeling. So do you have any idea on who will be a good, I guess, good modeler to follow, or maybe to read work of that person?
I think it's really hard to say names because I'll explain the why, because I think that for each, say for example that you're interested in scientifically investigating, I don't know, ADHD, right? I won't know who's a good modeler in that sub area because obviously those modelers are involved in that kind of research, and I'm obviously not an expert in that kind of research because modeling requires collaborating with people who are experts at collecting empirical data for your theories and models to be tested, but also you need to, as a modeler yourself, as a scientist yourself, you need to know who's doing good work, and you need to know who's got good theories, or you need to have your own good theories and so on. So I think the best way, I'll give like a meta answer to this, the best way to do this is you essentially look in when you're doing, if you're a PhD student, for example, this is standard, you do your literature review and you find out who are the people in your sub area that are doing that kind of modeling.
Yeah, no, that's really great advice. Yeah, I think we also, I guess, nearly are at 1 o'clock. So yeah, I think thank you very much, Olivia. This is really nice talk of you, and we really enjoy your talk. And feel free, all the community, to reach Olivia if you have more questions. There is also the contact of her and the paper as well. And yeah, so yeah, and also don't forget to join the next seminars and the event that also is shared in the talk as well. Okay, so with that, thank you very much, Olivia, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.